now we're going to look a little bit more closely at what happens when artists decide to take their stories from contemporary life, to rip them from the headlines, if you will. David was doing that a little bit with the intervention of the Sabine women. He was choosing that theme in response to contemporary events. But the painting I want to spend a bit of time looking at in this lecture is, again, one of my favorites. It's Géricault's Raft of Medusa from around 1818, 1819. This is genuinely an enormous painting. If the movies existed in the early part of the 19th century, Géricault might have wanted to make a movie instead. But instead, it's a painting that aspires to all, I think, the spectacle that will become cinema in the late 19th and early 20th century. We are looking at a scene that is, as I said, literally ripped from the headlines. The Medusa was a French frigate that ran aground off the coast of Mauritania, what is now Mauritania, in 1816, and it was seen as an incredibly scandalous French naval disaster. Many people died. The evacuation of the ship was extremely disorderly. The accident was due to the captain's error. In the end, nearly 150 people were put onto a makeshift raft. There weren't enough lifeboats to go around, and they were put on this enormous makeshift raft that almost immediately began to sink. The minute that many people were on it, there was scarcely no food and scarcely no water, and what food and water there was, much of it fell overboard. And by the time rescue comes, there are only 15 people left alive on that raft. Some of them died of dehydration. Some of them jumped overboard in despair. Some of them were thrown overboard because the raft was sinking. And some of them were ultimately eaten by the survivors in a desperate attempt to stay alive. And so it is definitely a sensational scene. We're looking at the moment just before rescue comes. In the very, very distance on the horizon, you can see a tiny ship, and that's what the figures in the midground are gesticulating towards so frantically. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at this painting because it places you right in the midst of the action. Like, as you stand in front of it, you are literally in the ocean, and there's a kind of falling of bodies towards you into the foreground, the bodies of the dead and dying, already a ghastly, sort of sickly green-yellow tinge, as if even those people who are still alive are nearly amongst the dead. As you go further into the painting and start to go from the midground to the background, it's almost as if you're swept up in the frantic effort of signaling to help as well, until you reach the very apex where an African sailor is waving his shirt aloft, trying desperately to get the attention of the ship in the background. It's a painting in which you see the male nude, but that male nude has become something kind of corrupt and decaying. And in fact, Géricault went to the morgue in Paris to study from dead flesh in order to get at precisely the kinds of effects that he was interested in. And the painting became quite an obsession to him as well. It's a painting that doesn't literally include references to some of the more horrific and sensational aspects of the survivor's experience. But if you look in the foreground, where an older male figure holds the body of his dead son, that figure is posed in a way that those who were versed in classical mythology would have recognized Ugolino from Dante's Inferno, and Ugolino in fact resorted to cannibalism. So you have that sense in which savvy viewers would have gotten just what was going on, even if they hadn't read the headlines. Painting in the 19th century, and especially paintings this large, were indeed spectator sport. They were appreciated by those in the know who had a lot of training in art history or a great sense of art connoisseurship, but they were also enjoyed by people from all walks of life who would have appreciated the great effects of realism, in this case, extremely sensational story, and its topicality as well. When we look at this painting by the American painter Winslow Homer called The Gulf Stream from 1899, it's a strange little work, and it's much smaller in size, but it takes on that thematic of tragedy at sea. We see a lone African-American sailor stranded on a boat, we think off the coast of the United States in the Gulf, and he's surrounded by sharks that are terrifying and also a little bit funny in their literalness. There's a way in which one can't help, I think now as a contemporary person, when one looks at this painting, to think a little bit about the movie Jaws and the way in which the shark was terrifying when it popped out of the sea by surprise. But if you got a chance to stare at it for a while, it became something a little bit ludicrous and mechanical looking. And these sharks also have that kind of combination of a horrific realism and something that almost verges on the caricatural at the same time. Homer would have had things like the Raft of the Medusa in mind, even as he's trying to make a more American scene. And it's worth saying that this painting was greeted with mixed reaction, as it were. On the one hand, this sort of sensational, strange scene that wasn't literally ripped from the headlines, but seemed as if it had to come from somewhere. And then also the kind of awkwardness with which it hints at the disaster that is coming from the man-eating sharks in the water circling the boat. So now with these two paintings in mind, Géricault's Raft of the Medusa and Homer's The Gulf Stream, I want to spend the rest of this lecture looking at two works by the contemporary American painter, Kerry James Marshall. Marshall has set for himself an extremely important project, and that is to say, to paint contemporary history painting, but to paint it in the full recognition of the possibilities and gaps of history painting, its strengths and its weaknesses, its predilection for certain kinds of stories, and its overlooking of other kinds of stories. The first painting that we're going to spend some time with is his Great America from 1994. And I want to say from the outset that I had the idea to look at the Marshall works with relationship to Géricault and Homer, because I had the great good fortune to see a Marshall exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington recently, and I want to just give a shout out to the National Gallery for giving me such great things to think about and to look at. So Great America from 1994 takes on a really important and really almost unrepresentable subject, and that is to say it's interested in the experience of the Middle Passage, the experience of enslaved people being transported from Africa to the Americas during the period of slavery. And I say almost unrepresentable because it is really hard to imagine how deeply scary and how deeply awful that must have been to be ripped from your home, taken on a boat under very poor conditions to God knows where, and have the rest of your life be taken out of your will and out of your power to determine what it was going to be like to spend the rest of your life in slavery. And in order to represent this, this subject, Marshall makes some really interesting and some really difficult sorts of choices. When we look at this painting, we are not sure what historical moment we're in actually. Something like the present moment, but at the same time something that seems almost dreamlike or fantasy-like. We are looking at a group of African figures loaded onto a little kind of carnival boat ride, moving into the distance towards a dark tunnel, a kind of amusement park ride where some kind of uncertain and scary, we think, based upon the little ghosts that are poking out, experience awaits them. So how can it be that something like a carnival ride could represent something as terrible as the experience of being brought into slavery in the New World? Well, first of all, I think it is because it sort of says, I have insufficient tools to represent the nature of this experience, and at the same time, I'm going to do it nonetheless through marshalling cues of contemporary life that people can identify with. What is it like to be poised on the edge of a really scary amusement park ride where you know you're going to be terrified, but you don't know the future that awaits you? Middle Passage wasn't like an amusement park ride, but Marshall also tells you very clearly that he knows that with the word that's inscribed on the top center of the painting, that word "wow" written in white on a red, kind of bloody, dripping banner is a very ironic wow. It's the irony of the insufficiency of an exclamation to evoke the terror of this particular experience. Most of the meaning of this painting is made by mobilizing competing and compounding cues drawn from the history of art. So on the one hand, we have a little bit of a nod to traditional perspectival painting in the way that the little boat is set on an orthogonal and seems to recede into the background. And then at the same time, the canvas is absolutely flattened by those scroll designs that go across the foreground that make you feel you're almost in a kind of billboard or signboard sort of space. Some of the elements of the painting are very precisely rendered. The little carnival boat, the kind of stylized waves around the boat that mimic the curlicue decorations on the boat. And then others are painted in a really loose and brushy manner that calls forth another set of painterly language conventions that are used to evoke emotion, which is to say that Marshall, coming of age as a painter in the late 20th century, would have had very much on his mind the example of abstract expressionist painting in the United States in the mid-20th century as a primary and highly valued mode of representing human emotion, and particularly of representing kind of existential crisis. So that kind of all that drippy, muscular, painterly painting done by folks like Jackson Pollock in the mid-20th century was taken to be a sort of moment when art was trying to represent feelings and emotions and states of being that were beyond the ability of representational painting to grasp. And Marshall signals to us that he knows all about that, and also signals in a way its insufficiency as well, because rather than kind of luscious, gooey blobs and drips and swipes of paint across the canvas, you get these kind of flat and drippy and sort of dried out references to abstract expressionism at the same time. Right next to Great America, I had the opportunity to see this work, Marshall's Gulf Stream from 2003, and it's a tremendous kind of juxtaposition. One, again, it gives you a sense of the range of Marshall's command of painting languages, and art historical references. You should be thinking about Homer's Gulf Stream, because certainly Marshall was when he was making this work. But this time, rather than a kind of sea-battered boat with one desiccated, weakened African body on the ship just waiting to be shark bait, you have this beautiful sailing vessel with the sail making this, again, lovely orthogonal sweep across the canvas, giving you this kind of sense of depth. And this time you see a middle-class black family out for a ride on the ocean. The painting is large, and it's organized at the same time almost like a souvenir picture postcard, that kind of decorative frame of rope and netting that goes around the outside edges and even has a bit of glitter mixed in it. The pelican and the little piers of the dock in the foreground that give you this kind of postcardy feel. You feel like you should be in an idyllic scene, but the sea is sort of choppy, and ominous clouds are gathering on the horizon. And once again, you're not sure whether these people are enjoying themselves or are about to run into trouble. And I think that kind of ambivalence about the security of experience is crucial to understanding African American experience throughout American history, and even to this day, where I think, even for middle-class families, and one could say that this is a sort of representation of middle-class leisure, there's this sense for African American families of being never quite as securely invested in those rights and privileges as one's white counterparts. And those are the real circumstances of race relations to this day, as much as we try to contest them and interrogate them and hopefully make things better. And Marshall gives you both sides of that. And he gives you both sides of that so wonderfully, on the one hand, because of his deep respect for and understanding of history and his thoughtful address to the historical experiences that he's trying to represent, and on the other hand, out of his deep respect for, deep address to, and deep interrogation of the conventions of history painting, which he knows so well, and knows well enough to be able to take them apart and put them back together in the making of new meaning and new stories in his work.